When a nation chooses to define itself, it is engaging in the same process that every individual must endure: the establishment of sovereignty. Sovereignty means you are not dictated to by someone else's whims. It means that your values are not borrowed, your decisions are not rented, and your future is not mortgaged to the approval of others. Nations, like people, falter when they lose their identity. They become fragmented, aimless, and subject to exploitation. When India decides to move toward Russia despite pressure from America, it is making a declaration of independence, not merely in a political sense, but in the deeper sense of identity itself. It is saying, we will define ourselves, and we will not let another define us. That is the foundation of strength. That is the beginning of genuine maturity. Dependency always appears attractive in the short term. It promises protection, stability, and comfort, but it comes at the cost of long-term strength. If a person always asks others to solve their problems, they never develop competence. Likewise, if a nation always depends on another for military protection, for economic stability, or for international validation, it sacrifices the ability to stand on its own feet. Dependency infantilizes. It creates the illusion of security while quietly eroding resilience. India has recognized that dependency on the West, particularly on America, could lead to exactly that trap. A nation of over 1 billion people cannot afford infantilization. It must be strong, it must be independent, and it must decide for itself. Think about the human psyche for a moment. When someone else tells you how to think, how to act, and what to value, you become less than what you could be. You hand over your destiny to someone else's judgment. That might feel safe, but it leaves you hollow. The same psychological truth applies at the geopolitical level. If India allows America to dictate its alliances, its energy sources, or its defense strategies, then India is no longer India. It becomes an echo, a shadow, a derivative of American interest, and shadows, while safe in the dark, vanish in the light of real conflict. Sovereignty means refusing to be a shadow. It means embodying the fullness of one's potential, even when it requires risk. Consider the historical context. For centuries, India lived under colonial rule. It knows better than most nations the price of subjugation, the cost of dependency on powers that claim to have your best interests at heart. Colonialism was not presented as domination. It was presented as guidance, as civilization, as help. But the reality was theft, exploitation, and suppression of self-determination. To fall into dependency on any great power today, even one as modern and advanced as America, is to repeat that mistake in a new costume. It is to trade political sovereignty for economic favors or strategic protection. India remembers its history, and because of that memory, it chooses sovereignty over dependency. Freedom is not free, and sovereignty is not safe. When you refuse dependency, you invite risk. But what is the alternative? To be perpetually bound by another's approval, to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term comfort. That is the coward's path, the path of the weak, the path of those who never grow. India's decision to strengthen ties with Russia is not about choosing sides. It is about refusing to be enslaved by the notion that there is only one side worth choosing. Freedom requires risk, and sovereignty requires courage. To choose otherwise is to shrink, to diminish, and to slowly erode the spirit of a nation. At the level of the individual, you see this same dynamic in family systems. If a child never steps out from under the shadow of his parents, he never becomes an adult. He remains forever a dependent, fragile, and unfinished human being. Nations, too, must grow up. They must accept responsibility for their decisions and face the dangers of standing alone. India is doing precisely that by asserting itself, by refusing to live in America's shadow, by seeking relationships that serve its people rather than the dictates of another power. This is not arrogance, it is adulthood. It is what maturity looks like when translated onto the global stage. Dependency corrodes dignity. When a man kneels before another for every need, his spine weakens, his will shrinks, and his sense of self evaporates. Nations are no different. Dignity comes from being able to say, "We made our choices, we bore the consequences, and we stood our ground." India has chosen dignity over convenience. That decision carries a heavy cost, but it is a cost worth paying. Dignity is the soil from which future strength grows. Without it, nations collapse into irrelevance, swallowed by the agendas of others who do not care for their flourishing. Sovereignty restores dignity, and dignity restores power. The psychological necessity of sovereignty is universal. A person who lacks sovereignty is like a leaf in the wind, tossed about by external forces, never knowing where they will land. That is chaos. Chaos is not life. It is survival without direction. For nations, the parallel is obvious. Without sovereignty, they drift, they react, they respond, but they never lead. They become pawns, not players. India does not want to be a pawn in America's grand strategy or Russia's ambitions. By choosing sovereignty, it accepts the responsibility of being a player, even if that means navigating dangerous waters with less protection. It is a choice between chaos and order, between drifting and directing. And what is identity, if not the act of saying, "This is who we are"? Sovereignty is identity made political. It is the refusal to compromise the core of one's being for the sake of convenience or fear. Just as an individual cannot live a fulfilled life while lying to themselves about who they are, a nation cannot thrive while pretending to be an extension of another's will. India is saying, we will not lie about who we are. We are not simply America's ally or Russia's client. We are India, and we will define ourselves. That act of self-definition is the most courageous thing any entity, human or nation, can undertake. If you strip everything else away, what you are left with is this: sovereignty is the act of shouldering responsibility. It is the recognition that no one else can carry the burden of your destiny, and while that burden may be heavy, it is yours, and therefore it gives you strength. Dependency is the opposite. It is the surrender of your destiny to someone else's shoulders. But no one can carry your destiny for you, not without deforming it, not without reshaping it into their own vision. India, by aligning with Russia against the expectations of America, is reclaiming its destiny. It is saying, we will carry our own burden, no matter the cost. And in that choice lies the seed of greatness. Pragmatism is the art of dealing with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. The problem with ideology is that it blinds us to complexity. It reduces the world into simplistic categories of good and evil, right and wrong, ally and enemy. But life is not that simple, and nations cannot afford to be naive. Ideological thinking seduces people because it provides certainty, but it is the certainty of a cage. Pragmatism, by contrast, is difficult because it demands constant negotiation with reality. It requires seeing the shades of gray, weighing options, and making choices that are not always clean. India's decision to lean toward Russia while keeping America at a distance reflects pragmatism over ideology. It is not about loyalty or betrayal. It is about survival and growth. When individuals cling to ideology, they become rigid, unable to adapt, and ultimately, they break when the world refuses to match their expectations. Nations that cling to ideology suffer the same fate. America often demands ideological loyalty. You must align with us, or you are against us. But such demands ignore the unique needs and challenges of every country. India, as a massive democracy with its own historical wounds and cultural depth, cannot afford to be trapped by ideological allegiance. It has to ask, what serves the interest of our people, our economy, and our future? Pragmatism provides answers where ideology provides slogans. It is slogans that crumble under pressure, but pragmatic decisions endure. Consider how pragmatism operates at the personal level. If you live by ideology, you might say, "I will never compromise." But in reality, compromise is often necessary to build relationships, careers, and families. Ideological rigidity alienates and isolates. Pragmatism says, "I will aim at the highest good, but I will also negotiate with the limitations of reality." That attitude does not weaken you. It strengthens you because it makes you adaptable. India demonstrates this when it refuses to break ties with Russia despite pressure from the West. It understands that Russian oil and defense partnerships provide stability and affordability, things the people of India need. Ideology would demand sacrifice. Pragmatism demands provision. We must also remember that ideology often masks power. When America lectures India on who to partner with, it is not simply moral outrage. It is strategy. It wants to maintain influence, to ensure loyalty, and to keep control of global alignments. But pragmatism sees through this mask. It says, "We recognize your interest, but we must serve ours first." That clarity is what prevents manipulation. When people adopt ideology blindly, they become tools in the hands of those who know how to wield it. India refuses to be a tool. It chooses relationships based on utility, not on rhetoric, and that decision is not cynical, it is responsible. Pragmatism is also about recognizing limits. No nation, not even America, has unlimited power. The world is too complex, too interconnected, too volatile for one ideology to dominate forever. Pragmatism accepts that. It says, "We will work with multiple partners because no single power can meet all our needs." India sees Russia as a partner in energy and defense, America as a partner in technology and trade, and other nations as partners in different arenas. This multipolar approach is born from pragmatism, not loyalty. It acknowledges the limit of every alliance and the necessity of diversification. That is precisely how resilient systems are built. Ideology appeals to pride, but pragmatism appeals to responsibility. It is easy for a nation to declare loyalty to one camp, to join the chorus of moral certainty, to bask in the approval of others. But that is pride, not strength. Real strength comes from responsibility. The responsibility to feed your people, to secure your borders, to grow your economy, and to maintain your sovereignty. Pragmatism is the tool that fulfills that responsibility. India is demonstrating this by refusing to abandon Russia, because to do so would spike energy prices, destabilize its economy, and weaken its defense capacity. That would be ideological loyalty at the cost of responsibility. Pragmatism avoids such traps. There is also a psychological depth to this principle. Ideology is often fueled by fear. People cling to rigid beliefs because they fear the chaos of uncertainty. Pragmatism, however, accepts uncertainty as the price of truth. It acknowledges that life is unpredictable, that situations shift, and that adaptability is essential. A nation, like a person, must step into that uncertainty with courage. India does not know the future shape of global power. It cannot guarantee which alliances will endure or collapse, but it refuses to live in fear of uncertainty. It navigates with pragmatism, adjusting course as reality unfolds. That is courage in action. History punishes ideology but rewards pragmatism. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its rigid ideology. Unable to adapt to changing circumstances, nations that insisted on blind loyalty to one power often found themselves abandoned when circumstances shifted. Pragmatism, on the other hand, allows nations to bend without breaking, to shift without losing identity, to survive upheaval with dignity intact. India has learned this from history. It does not pledge blind allegiance to America, nor does it surrender entirely to Russia. Instead, it balances, adapts, and maneuvers with care. That is the mark of wisdom drawn from painful historical lessons. Pragmatism is not weakness. It is strength concealed in humility. It admits that no nation is perfect, no alliance eternal, no ideology universally true. It humbles itself before reality, but in doing so, it builds resilience. Ideology is brittle. Pragmatism is flexible. When America insists on ideological loyalty, it is demanding brittleness from its allies, but India chooses flexibility. It knows that strength lies not in rigid declarations, but in the ability to endure storms by bending without snapping. That is the pragmatist's wisdom, and it is a wisdom that creates stability where ideology creates fracture. At its core, pragmatism is about survival. It asks, what decisions keep us alive, strong, and capable of growth? Ideology, in contrast, often sacrifices survival for the illusion of purity. Nations that cling to ideology burn themselves out in wars, economic collapses, or diplomatic isolation. Nations that cling to pragmatism endure. India is choosing endurance. By aligning with Russia pragmatically, it is ensuring energy for its people, security for its borders, and leverage in international negotiations. That is not betrayal of values. It is the affirmation of responsibility. And responsibility, not ideology, is what defines maturity. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to face fear and move forward despite it. Every meaningful decision in life involves risk. You might lose friends, you might lose security, you might even lose your reputation, but if the decision is aligned with truth, then it is worth the cost. Nations, just like individuals, are confronted with moments where they must decide whether to please others or stand firm. India's partnership with Russia in the face of American pressure is precisely such a moment. It is easy to follow the crowd, easy to bow down to the loudest voice, easy to pretend neutrality. But courage does not reside in safety. It resides in the willingness to endure criticism, to bear consequences, and to uphold one's convictions even when the world disapproves. Responsibility always comes with a price. If you want to speak the truth, you will offend someone. If you want to pursue independence, you will anger those who depend on your dependence. The same applies to nations. By rejecting America's demand to isolate Russia, India is deliberately stepping into the storm of disapproval. But that is the essence of strength, the willingness to face disapproval for the sake of higher goals. Avoiding conflict at all costs only ensures that conflict finds you in a weaker state. The courage to bear consequences is what transforms decisions into destiny. Without that courage, nations and individuals alike collapse under pressure. Think about the individual who refuses to stand for what he believes. He avoids confrontation, hoping for peace. But what he actually gains is resentment, weakness, and regret. Over time, he becomes bitter, blaming others for his own cowardice. Nations follow the same path when they refuse courage. They choose comfort, but in doing so, they sacrifice sovereignty. India understands this truth. Its decision to align with Russia in certain domains is not comfortable. It knows sanctions could come, reputations could suffer, and partnerships could strain. But it has chosen the discomfort of courage over the comfort of cowardice. The weight of criticism is heavy, but that weight is precisely what builds strength. Just as a body grows stronger when lifting weights, a nation grows stronger when it resists external pressure. Courage is the willingness to carry that weight instead of fleeing from it. India's refusal to abandon Russia is a form of lifting. It is carrying the criticism of America and its allies in order to build independence. Every great achievement in history has come from someone bearing the unbearable. Nations that fold to pressure may win temporary relief, but they lose the chance at greatness. India, by contrast, is training its resilience by enduring the weight of global disapproval. Courage is inseparable from vision. Without vision, courage is wasted energy. You cannot willingly bear consequences unless you believe in the worth of the outcome. India's vision is to secure its energy, its defense, and its long-term independence. That vision makes the criticism bearable. Without it, the pressure would break any government or people. The same is true for you as an individual. Unless you believe in the worth of your goal, you will not have the courage to endure opposition. Vision fuels courage, and courage transforms vision into reality. That is the universal pattern of growth, whether in a person or in a nation. There is also an ethical dimension to courage. To bear consequences is to declare that truth is more important than comfort. That is an ethical choice. Cowardice is not simply weakness. It is betrayal of yourself, of your people, of your potential. Nations that refuse courage betray their citizens because they trade away long-term security for temporary approval. India is refusing that betrayal. It is saying, we will endure criticism so that our people have fuel, so that our borders are secure, so that our independence is preserved. That is ethics in action, to shoulder pain today so that others may live better tomorrow. Courage always isolates. When you stand firm, do not expect applause. More often than not, you will be alone, because people fear the consequences you are willing to endure. But that isolation is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of authenticity. India's stance has left it isolated at times in global forums, with nations questioning its loyalty. Yet, loyalty to truth is greater than loyalty to external masters. That isolation becomes a forge, shaping a stronger identity. The loneliness of courage is temporary, but the strength it produces is permanent. Those who never experience it will never truly grow. The paradox of courage is that it attracts respect in the long run, even from those who once condemned you. Individuals who refuse to bow down may be hated at first, but over time, people recognize their integrity. Nations operate the same way. Today, America may criticize India's decisions. Tomorrow, it may respect India's independence, because true allies are not those who obey blindly, but those who stand firm with their own identity intact. Courage might create enemies in the short term, but in the long term, it creates respect, and respect is far more valuable than forced obedience. Respect cannot be demanded. It can only be earned through courage. We should not forget that courage is contagious. When one individual dares to speak, others find their voice. When one nation dares to stand, others feel less afraid. India's courage in pursuing its path despite American opposition sends a signal to the world. Sovereignty is possible, independence is achievable, and consequences can be endured. That example may embolden other nations to act with similar strength. Just as a family, a community, or an organization becomes stronger when one person stands firm, the global order can shift when one nation refuses submission. Courage spreads by example, and that is how real transformation begins. At the deepest level, courage is the essence of being human. To live at all is to risk, and to risk is to invite consequences. The only alternative is to shrink, to hide, and to never truly live. Nations embody the same truth. If they wish to thrive, they must risk disapproval, sanctions, and isolation. India is embodying that human essence on the geopolitical stage by choosing courage over cowardice. It is willing to bear the burden of its convictions. That willingness is what separates the nations that merely survive from those that make history. And history always remembers the courageous, never the compliant. Peace is not maintained by obedience to one master, but by balancing many powers. When a single authority dominates, it breeds resentment, rebellion, and ultimately conflict. Multipolarity, by contrast, distributes power, creating equilibrium. It is the same in families, organizations, and societies. When one voice silences all others, chaos brews beneath the surface. A healthy system thrives when influence is shared and balanced. India recognizes this truth at the global level. By working with Russia, America, and others in a measured way, it is fostering balance rather than submission. Stability emerges not from servitude, but from a web of relationships that counterbalance one another. That is the wisdom of multipolar stability. Blind loyalty, on the other hand, creates fragility. If you tie yourself to one authority, your fate is bound to theirs. When they stumble, you stumble. When they collapse, you collapse. Dependence is always dangerous, whether in the life of an individual or in the destiny of a nation. America often demands blind loyalty, framing it as partnership, but it is partnership only on its own terms. India has refused this path because it sees the inherent weakness in such dependence. By aligning with multiple powers, India gains options. Options are resilience. Blind loyalty narrows the path to survival, but balanced relationships widen it. Think of a person who builds their entire identity around one relationship. If that relationship fails, their world collapses. That is the risk of blind loyalty. Nations that bind themselves exclusively to one power face the same danger. The Soviet Union's satellites learned this lesson when their entire political order crumbled overnight. Multipolar balance avoids this fragility. It distributes dependence so that no single failure is catastrophic. India, by deepening ties with Russia while still engaging with America, is building a system that cannot be destroyed by a single collapse. It is building resilience into its identity. That is how nations survive shocks. History provides countless examples of the dangers of unipolar obedience. Empires rose demanding absolute loyalty, but every empire eventually fell, and with it, so did the nations that had tied themselves too closely. Multipolar arrangements, though messier, have proven more durable. The balance of power in Europe, however unstable at times, prevented absolute domination for centuries. It allowed nations to maneuver, survive, and even flourish. India is repeating that principle now, refusing to place all its weight on America's side. It understands that a balanced global order, though imperfect, is far safer than the fragile security of unipolar dominance. There is also a psychological truth beneath this. A person who only listens to one voice loses perspective. They stop questioning, stop growing, stop thinking critically. Their mind narrows until it becomes incapable of handling complexity. Nations that listen to only one master undergo the same decay. India, by engaging with multiple partners, keeps its perspective sharp. It must evaluate, adapt, and adjust constantly. This constant negotiation fosters wisdom because it forces awareness of multiple angles. Blind loyalty produces stagnation. Balanced engagement produces growth. That is why multipolarity is not just political. It is psychological maturity expressed at the national scale. Blind loyalty may feel easier in the short term. It reduces decision-making, removes uncertainty, and provides the illusion of security. But illusions always collapse when tested by reality. Multipolar stability, though demanding, builds lasting security. It requires effort, negotiation, and sometimes discomfort, but it produces resilience that cannot be faked. India accepts the complexity of multipolarity because it knows the alternative is dangerous simplicity. The world is not simple, and any approach that pretends otherwise is doomed. To live in reality is to embrace complexity. That is the mark of strength, not weakness. Critics often accuse pragmatists of betrayal when they choose balance over blind loyalty. But true betrayal is the refusal to protect your own people. Loyalty to truth must come before loyalty to any external master. India knows that its primary responsibility is not to America, not to Russia, not to Europe, but to its citizens. By fostering multipolar ties, it ensures access to resources, technology, defense, and markets from multiple sources. That security serves its people far better than ideological obedience. The accusation of betrayal comes from those who demand servitude, not from those who value genuine partnership. At the level of global stability, multipolarity reduces the risk of catastrophic conflict. If one power dominates, rivals will eventually rise to challenge it, often violently. But if power is distributed, competition becomes contained within balance. This balance may be tense, but it is far safer than absolute dominance. India's strategy contributes to this balance by ensuring no single bloc monopolizes influence. It is not just serving its own interest, it is stabilizing the global order. That is the paradox of balance. By serving yourself wisely, you contribute to the stability of the larger system. Blind loyalty does the opposite. It destabilizes everything. There is also a moral lesson here. Blind loyalty is submission to authority without question. Balance is the moral courage to question authority and to refuse total control. A free individual does not hand over their entire will to one master. A free nation cannot either. India's insistence on multipolar partnerships is a moral statement. Freedom matters more than approval. It is the same ethic that drives people to resist tyrants, to speak truth to power, to refuse domination. That ethic, when scaled to the level of a nation, produces policies that may be criticized in the short term, but respected in the long run. The future will belong to nations that balance, not nations that obey. The world is shifting toward complexity, toward interconnectedness, toward multipolar realities that no single ideology can control. Nations that cling to blind loyalty will suffer when their masters falter. Nations that embrace balance will thrive because they can adapt, shift, and maneuver. India has chosen to thrive. Its decision to work with Russia while ignoring American pressure is not treachery, it is foresight. It is preparing for a world where power is shared, not monopolized, and where survival belongs to those willing to balance with courage and wisdom,